professor of leadership studies here in the Jepson School, and I'll be the moderator today. And I'll ask the panel members if you would introduce yourself, starting with Dr. Levy.
I'm David Levy, an economist at George Mason.
I'm Tony Ellis. I'm a philosopher from VCU.
I'm Gloria Taylor. I'm the staff ethicist for the United Network for Organ Sharing.
Thank you. So now we'll have the coin toss if everybody's ready, and I will just arbitrarily choose this team. And when I throw, I'm not good at this, I'm not a sports person, so I will throw it up and you call, please. Okay.
Tails?
Oops. I'm really not good at this. Heads. Okay, so would you like to go first?
Second.
Or second? Second. Okay.
I'd like to review that. Sorry to inquire. Do we get paper?
Could we have some paper, some scratch paper, please?
Yes, I will pass.
Thank you.
Your case is case number 2. Your question is it morally permissible for scientists to conduct research on their own children? If so, why? If not, why not? I'll read the question again. Is it morally permissible for scientists to conduct research on their own children? If so, why? If not, why not? Questions are up. So at this point, you will have 10 minutes to present your argument, to have one person from your team present the argument. And at the 1 minute point, would you like a hand or verbal signal?
Just a hand will be fine.
Thank you.
Okay. We'd like to start by thanking the judges for coming to participate in this. We really appreciate it. But in regards to the question, is it morally permissible for scientists to conduct research on their own children, Clemson contends that no, this practice is not morally justifiable. We base this contention on the principle that parents have an obligation to act in the best interest of their children, and also on the principle of non-maleficence, which holds that people should act in ways that produce no harm. We will elaborate on these arguments in a minute, but before we get to the arguments, Clemson would like to make some qualifications about exactly the types of research that our arguments pertain to. There are many different types of research, such as questionnaires or observational studies or other types of research, and we believe that our arguments only pertain to the types of research that would require a parent to alter their behavior towards the child than they would otherwise act as just a normal parent. So we do not believe there is any moral conflict with asking your child to fill out a simple questionnaire and then having some other, like sending it off to be studied by another researcher, but we feel that there is a moral conflict in subjecting your child to an observational study in which you may act differently towards that child in order to see how they will respond in certain scenarios. So with this in mind, we'd like to move to our first argument that parents have an obligation to act in the best interest of their child. Human beings have one of the longest developmental periods and child raising periods because of the extremely long time it takes for a child's brain to develop. In the early years of childhood, children cannot always foresee the future consequences of their actions, so it is up to the parents to determine what behavior, what actions will be in the best long-term interest of their child. For if the parents do not do it, whose responsibility would it be? So we believe that the parents have an obligation to make decisions that will be in the child's best interest. And we believe that the role of researcher and the role of parent have an inherent conflict and that both roles cannot be partaken simultaneously, and that this conflict will interfere with the parent's role to act in the best interest of the child. The role of a researcher is to further scientific knowledge, and many times in doing this, or in all studies, they must be an objective observer so as to not bias the data or in other ways invalidate the data. This seems inherently in conflict with the role of parent, which is to act emotionally interested towards their child and to act in the best interest. So it seems that when performing some sort of research on their child, the objective of the emotional parent and the objectives of the impartial researcher will be in conflict. Now, we're not claiming that this conflict will necessarily turn the child into some sort of sociopath, but we're just saying that anything that can negatively affect a child and basically cause the child to be unhappy that is not necessary from the parental view and that is not done by the parent in the interest of the child should not be partaken by a parent. So we feel I guess we're to draw an analogous situation, we feel that the a good example of how the role one takes can affect the way one acts can be seen in the Zimbardo prison study of 1971. So we'll outline this study and show how the role that these people took affected the way they acted. So in the Zimbardo study, he took 24 college students and placed them in different roles. Half of them were prison guards and half of them were prison inmates. And the study was designed to determine and analyze the psychology of prison life, to see how these students, when placed in the role of prison guard and when placed in the role of inmate, if this would affect the way they acted at the beginning. The study was designed to last 2 weeks, but it had to be cut short after 6 days because the prison guards began dehumanizing and embarrassing the inmates. And while there was nothing in the college students' personalities that would suggest they would take on these, would dehumanize the inmates, it was the role of prison guard that they were put in that caused them to act in this way. And so we've kind of drawn this analogy between how the role that you are put in can affect the way you act. So similarly, in this case, if the parent steps outside of the parental role and places itself in a research subject role with the child, they could unconsciously begin acting differently towards their child than they otherwise would if they only acted as a parent towards their child. In preparing for this case, we considered the objection that if parents are supposed to act in the best interest of their children, they should also be allowed to determine exactly what those best interests are and determine how they should raise their children. So it would seem that maybe the parent should be allowed to decide to perform the research on the subjects. But we feel this only applies when the parent is making decisions in the best interest of their children. We use, for example, spanking. Many people believe that spanking is unethical and ineffective and that a responsible parent should not spank their children. However, we believe that if a parent feels that spanking their child is the best way to discipline them and is in the child's best interest, then it is parents' prerogative to spank their child. However, in this case, they're not performing research with the intent of bettering their child. They're merely doing it with their own scientific objectives in mind. And so we feel that in this case, because of the conflict of role between parent and researcher, it is morally impermissible for science to conduct this research. We'll now move to our second argument, which is based on the principle of non-maleficence, which holds that people should act in ways that cause no harm. As we've stated, we believe the inherent conflict of roles will negatively affect the child, and while the parents are not acting with the intent of causing harm, they are subjecting their children to an unnecessary risk, particularly the possible negative conflicts from the conflict of roles. We'd like to kind of emphasize the conflict of role part. It's not necessarily the risk inherent in the research that will cause harm to the child. It's the conflict of roles. So if an objection was brought up that maybe taking your child to Taco Bell instead of giving them a salad or allowing your child to play on a jungle gym is also maybe an unnecessary risk, this decision is made with the best interest of the child in mind, with the parent allowing them the freedom to explore themselves and take risks in order to determine their boundaries. We feel that the strongest objection that the opposing team can maybe bring to this is based on the principle of utility, that perhaps the benefits from research could outweigh the consequences. If you have an autistic child, like in the study, you're able to study them for a much longer continuous time span and could use maybe your personal knowledge of the subject to further interpret the data. However, we believe that this utilitarian argument can have dangerous implications. Dr. Rasher was a researcher with Nazi support who performed experiments in the 1940s that tested the effects of hypothermia on concentration victims in order to better treat the German troops who had hypothermia. Throughout his experiments, he would place concentration camp victims in vats of freezing water in order to determine the effects on their body. And throughout the course of the study, many of these subjects died. So while the studies probably did result in better treatment of the German troops, I doubt that anybody would really necessarily agree that the treatment of the subjects would warrant these benefits. And while this case is, of course, much more extreme in that we're not claiming the children will die from the research, it also has much more extreme benefits in saving the German troops' lives. Also, we think that the benefits that might result from this study will be contingent on the fact that the scientific community accepts the data from the study as viable, and we do not believe this will be the case. The American Psychological Association's Principle of Ethical Conduct and Code of Conduct, Section 3.05 states that a psychologist should not participate in multiple roles with their subjects. They define a multiple role as any sort of relationship outside of the researcher-subject relationship. So in this case, the multiple role would be the role of parent and child. And it seems that the American Psychological Association believes that having this role will necessarily conflict with the study, and that the results of the study will not necessarily be viable because of maybe a bias in interpreting the data or acting towards your child and wanting your child to perform well in the study that might unconsciously influence how the child behaves. So in conclusion, Clemson believes that it is not morally permissible for scientists to conduct research on their own children based on the principle that parents have an obligation to act in the best interest of their children. And we believe that there's an inherent conflict in the role of researcher and the role of parent, and that a responsible parent should not subject their children to any unnecessary harm, such as this conflict of interest. And also through the principle of non-maleficence, which holds that people should act in ways that will cause no harm. And because of this negative effect that could take place with the children, we believe that a responsible parent should not perform research on the children. Thank you.
Thank you. Chapel Hill, you have 1 minute to confer, and afterwards you will have 5 minutes to respond.
We'd like to thank Clemson for their very interesting presentation, and we'd like to further flesh out some of their views, talk about some ethical concerns that they didn't necessarily cover in their presentation, and provide a few objections. A first objection that I thought of when considering this view, Clemson's position seemed to state that because a researcher has a different set of duties than a parent must always act in the best interest of their child. A researcher should be trying to answer a hypothesis of some kind, that because these are two different duties, they would always contradict, and a parent engaging in research would therefore be a worse parent if their behavior was altered. I think it's easy to think of a counterexample in which a child's participation in research may lead to particular benefits for the child, perhaps coming to the lab every weekend with their parent, maybe filling out surveys or getting in an fMRI machine. I've been in one before, it's kind of fun. That the child might enjoy this, enjoy spending more quality time with their parent, and this might actually be a benefit in their life. I'm just wondering if this would contradict their position that all research with children is inherently harmful, and if this sort of interaction between a parent and a child would be unacceptable according to their view.
Further, it seems that Clemson is making the argument that because parents who are researchers have this competing duty to their children, that to have their children's best interests at heart and still the duty to the research. I think that then you could make the argument from that any parent that involves their children in research would be compromising that duty, because it seems that if in the case of non-therapeutic research where there is no benefit to the child, then there seems to be some other kind of motivation there. Maybe the parent who involves their children in research isn't exactly the researcher, but is just particularly interested in the case. So is there some kind of competing duty for all child research? Is any child research morally acceptable?
Something we'd like to discuss and hope that you guys can flesh out is 2 points. One is the fact that there's a conflict of interest between adults' duties as a parent and their interests as a researcher, and that, of course, has been a big issue in the scientific community. And another big thing is corrupting data, because children will be influenced by their special relationship and feel obliged to provide a particular result. This has been a huge problem in the academic community, as professors are very interested in student data, but students often feel psychologically obliged to provide a certain result because A, they know that there's a certain power control here that professors have, or B, they just want to please their professor.
We believe that in general, it wasn't fully highlighted in your presentation, that researchers have what we could argue as an ethical duty to provide accurate and unbiased data to the scientific community, and it may be problematic, researchers and their children interacting, that the quality of this scientific data might be compromised in some way. Additionally, you brought up in one of your objections the Nazi research example. I think the main push of this example was how we weigh the utilitarian concerns that a research may provide for the greater good versus deontological rights-based claims of what happens when this research may be providing a good, but at the same time violating an individual's rights. We would like if you guys would talk a little bit more about this conflict, and as perhaps you suggested, do rights-based claims always override utilitarian claims of the greatest good?
And further, we thought a weakness in your argument was not addressing therapeutic research in which the child would then receive some benefit. So in the case of a parent researcher who happens to study some form of rare cancer and the child has that cancer, would participation in the research then be beneficial to the child, and would that be in the child's best interest as a parent? Would that duty be compromised to have the child's best interest versus their duty as a researcher?
Additionally, I think the issue of consent is really crucial in all scientific research. Just outlining your position about when consent is necessary, if children in general, regardless of whether they're interacting with their parents, can provide consent for research of this kind, and how consent is altered by this parent-child relationship.
Okay, Clemson, you have 1 minute to confer, and after that, 5 minutes to respond.
You can say dad if the person is treating you as objectively as. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what that's because it's one of them. That's it. You want to say that? Yeah. Okay. I've got a response to him. Just go.
Okay, thanks UNC for y'all's commentary. You brought up a lot of good objections and some good points. So we're going to try to address all of them. But it seemed that the main question y'all are sort of concerned with was what if the studies have benefits for the children? So I guess we're going to kind of start with that question. And we'd like to point out again that we don't feel it's the actual research that's unethical. We believe it's the inherent conflict between the role of researcher and the role of parent. So in the case of the therapeutic research, if a parent believes that research will be beneficial for their children, we don't think there's anything wrong with that so long as they're not the ones actually performing the research. If a scientist who is also a parent wants to sign their child up for research at their university for somebody else to conduct, we think that's perfectly fine. Along with the consent thing, it's not. We feel that the children, in this case, don't really have the autonomy to make their own decisions. Because they're under their parental guidance, it's up to the parents to decide what's in their best interest and to determine if they should participate in research or not. As it mentioned in the study, one of the researchers actually got his or her husband to sign a consent form for the child as an objective third party saying that the research is okay. So we believe that in this case, as long as the researcher is not the one who is actually performing the research, there is nothing about unethical for in-child research in general. So you said one thing you pointed out was that there may be beneficial for the children. Participating in research with a parent may have benefits for the child. Say, the example they pointed out, Victor went hiking with his dad and has fond memories of it. But we feel that this is an unnecessary risk. Why could Victor not go hiking with his dad, not under the guise of research? Or in the case of going to the lab and filling out a survey with his dad, which we actually said was fine in the beginning. We kind of made the qualification that this is only for observational studies and not filling out questionnaires. We feel that there's a difference between going to the lab and kind of going to work with daddy and like being daddy's work. There's one thing to go to a lab and see your dad perform experiments on other people. It's also a different feeling to have your father perform research on you in the home and wonder if you can go to your father with questions and say, Dad, look, I'm really having trouble in school with this, and have the fear that he's not going to address it as a parent but more as a researcher and say, well, why are you having trouble? What sort of, I guess, like what kind of academic benefits can I get out of this instead of trying to help you through your studies in this example. Also, in regards to the objection you brought up about the corrupting data, we completely agree with you. At the very end of our presentation, we mentioned that we don't feel that the scientific community will accept these principles based on the code of conduct that the American Psychological Association has. They explicitly, it's not actually a forbiddance, it's more of a guideline, but they believe that a researcher should not partake in multiple roles. So it seems to us as well that this research would not be viable. So in regards to the utility thing, we don't believe that the benefits would outweigh any sort of negative results because we don't feel there will really be that many benefits. We feel that the scientific community will recognize the bias that is inherent in these studies and will not really accept the results of them.
And furthermore, y'all made a contention that seemed to say that we said that all research was harmful in a way, and we don't deny the potential benefits of research, especially on children. There are potential goods to be drawn, yet Clemson just contends at the end of the day that the risk of an altered or compromised relationship isn't worth it. The duration and intensity of such disruption of the parent-child relationship is far greater than a child, say, enjoying a weekend trip to the lab. And there's a risk of the child in the study perhaps saying, not knowing if he can say daddy, or not feeling the need to say it because this person is treating him as objectively as any other 3-year-old in the study. So we understand that studies are necessary. There's a whole slew of health problems for children that need to be alleviated quickly. We just don't feel that it's necessary for parents to test their own children. We would say let another scientist do it, and at all costs preserve the parent-child relationship. Clemson rests.
Yeah, just to kind of wrap everything up in conclusion, we don't feel that child research is unethical at all. If it's the parents' prerogative to decide if they would like to allow their child to participate in somebody else's research, we believe it's the inherent conflict within the child, the role of the researcher and the role of parent. We don't believe that you can be an emotionally attached parent and an objective, unbiased observer at the same time. And so any results that might come from these studies will probably be viewed as unviable from the scientific community. And so we believe that as a responsible parent, they should not perform research on their children. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we'll ask the judges to confer briefly, and then they will have 10 minutes to ask questions of Clemson.
Right. I have a couple ethically relevant considerations I think that were kind of glossed over. And one for me is you seem to talk about the researcher and the parent in a singular fashion. I'm concerned about the fact that there's a dual nature in parents. I mean, lots of kids have two parents. So to me, I need some more information about what's the potential of a shared decision-making process if there's more than one parent involved, and also the impact that that might have on the family norms, you know.
Could you clarify what family norms you're talking about?
Well, I mean, just the average interaction of the family, let's say. I mean, there could be a whole broad spectrum. I mean, the parents could agree on whether the research is okay, or they could disagree, or, you know, the child could have almost a, you know, acting toward one parent in one way and the other parent in another way. It would, you know, it has the potential to disrupt that nuclear unit.
Well, as our main point was, we feel that performing research on your child is unethical from the one parent standpoint. So from the other parent, it would mainly seem that it's how they respond to this lack of ethicality. The case states that one person performed research on his son, and that it was a sore point between him and his wife, that she did not want him to do it, but he went through with it anyways. And so it seems that this would create a tension within the family.
However, even if they were to both agree on the decision, we still feel that the roles would conflict, and it would cause a rift in at least one parent and the child, and then that rift could cause a rift in the entire family. And we don't want to put any child or family at that risk, and we don't feel that it's a necessary risk. And there are other roles for a parent, as far as a friend or an employee, but we don't feel that those other roles conflict the same way that a scientist does, and a parent shouldn't step into the role of a scientist regardless of the situation or the agreement.
And in regards to the family norms, we feel that because if we were to make predictions, we would feel that the child would probably feel objectified by the parent performing the research, and would go to the other parent in as more for like advice. Anytime they had some sort of problem, we would foresee that they would not go to the parent who's performing the research. And in regards to the family norms, it seems like if the dad's performing the research, then the child will be more likely to go towards the mom and rely on the mom for sort of emotional development, whereas they might even view the dad as not a dad, but as more of somebody who they have an obligation to, I guess, meet his expectations.
A central pillar of your argument is the inherent conflict between the two roles that you mentioned, the researcher and the parent, which you characterize as being on the one hand impartial, on the other hand more emotional. Actually, there's probably no parent on either side of the debate here, but I've been a parent 3 times over, and I wonder if this isn't oversimplifying things. I mean, my own relationship to my children, and I think this is pretty universal, is that I adopt all sorts of roles, some of them necessarily impartial, some of them necessarily emotional. For instance, I give my child advice about what to do after she leaves school. I assume that I adopt a sort of impartial standpoint. I'm not influenced by emotion. So all sorts of roles that parents adopt, and it's not plain to me that the risk involved in this particular one is really all that large.
We feel that is a very strong objection that we kind of struggle with, which is why we mainly, I guess, narrowed our answer in on studies that will, I guess, significantly cause the parent to alter their behavior and act differently towards their child. we don't feel that, say if they're a food researcher, they make a new type of brownie and they ask their kid, like, hey, what do you think? Does this taste good to you? We feel the danger comes, I guess the difference in this is that when you tell your daughter what you think she should do with her future, you're telling her based on what you think is in her best interest. Whether or not you have a personal agenda and you want her to be an attorney but she wants to be an artist, if you tell her, you know, I think that being an attorney you'll be much more financially secure, you're telling her this in her best interest. So even though maybe you're acting impartially, you still are, I guess, guiding her in ways that you think will be best for her. Whereas we believe that when a psychologist is performing research on his child, he is doing this with his own scientific objectives in mind and is not really considering how it might affect his child.
Yeah, furthermore, we grant the number of roles. If you think a parent plays the role every day of educator, of mentor, of food provider, of friend, of playmate, all these different roles. We'd even say that the role like a mentor, you would hope that we would have more of an objective psychologist kind of view here. We would grant the objectivity of such a role. But whether these roles, playmate, educator, friend, are objective or subjective, the best interest of the child still exists within these roles as a parent. We feel that the scientist can't exactly embody these best interests because, as UNC noted, the scientist is looking to prove a hypothesis one way or the other. We feel that this role doesn't simply, even though it might be objective in the same way that a parent mentoring at times can be objective, the best interest of the child doesn't exist in the same way.
Let me, on the parental decision making, I wonder whether you're not taking into account that some activity is looked on as a chore, and it's important for the family income, family well-being, for kids to do some chores. I want to give you a famous example in statistics, where an important statistician had his daughter throw 10,000 coins 10,000 times, and then count the distribution of runs. This was going to go into his textbook, and that certainly wasn't to the best interest of the child in any direct sense. May very well have been to the best interest of her to get dad's textbook published so that she can go to better college. So that there's a line of research where kid becomes maybe not part of the, not a participant, but a co-experimenter. And so that there's I think there's sort of what an experiment looks like, what the kid's role in the experiment is actually a very subtle, very complicated thing.
That works.
We feel that in this case, that line of research would not be unethical. You're right, there is a very fine line, it would seem, between these, and we almost feel that it would need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. But in this case, it seems that he's not really examining the behavior of his daughter. He's merely allowing his daughter to help him design an experiment. He could have very well flipped the coin 10,000 times by himself. I guess it would kind of depend on whether he forced his daughter to do this. If she didn't want to do it, then maybe in that case it would be unethical. But if she said, Daddy, what are you doing today? Why are you flipping a coin so many times? Can I help? And then he allows her to participate in the experiment with him, then yeah, I mean, that seems like that would be a perfectly ethical thing to do. I think the main point is just that it's not really, he's not acting differently towards his daughter as a result, or in order to facilitate this research. He's merely interacting with her and allowing her to really, I guess, facilitate the research herself. She's, in essence, the researcher in this case. She's not the one being researched.
this point, we'll ask the judges to complete their scores, but not reveal them yet. All right, the roles are now reversed, and we will now turn the question to the other team. All right, team 2. Your case is case number 6. Your question is the Kenyan government morally justified in using armed guards and electric fences to prevent illegal settlements in the country's national parks? If so, why? If not, why not? I'll read it one more time. Is the Kenyan government morally justified in using armed guards and electric fences to prevent illegal settlements in the country's national parks? If so, why? If not, why not? Chapel Hill, you'll have 2 minutes to confer, and then 10 minutes for one person to present.
I'd first like to thank everyone for coming out here and listening to us this afternoon. The question at hand is using violent measures or putting up fences and guards in order to keep people out of the parks morally permissible to do. Team Carolina would like to argue that no, it is not morally permissible, if only because we feel it is the responsibility of the government to find alternative solutions to the squatter problem. First off, the ethical dimensions of this case are that the squatters are using up land resources that other people can use, and that they are hurting other Kenyans in the area, and that the government, should the government have a responsibility to deal with these people in an effective manner. And we would argue that yes, they do have the responsibility to serve both the squatters in the park and the rest of the Kenyans, but with a solution that is ethically and economically viable. And we do not believe that putting up fences and using guards is economically or ethically viable. A better solution would instead be to use measures to remove all squatters from the land and relocate them in areas where they can continue to lead the sort of life that the lifestyle that they have within the park without detracting from the sort of business and environmental issues that the park already has. We will address this argument using Aldo Leopold's land ethic as well as utilitarianism. As far as land ethic goes, this states that we have a responsibility as human moral agents to take care of our environment because our environment is an extension of ourselves. We are all part of this community. To take care of the environment is to take care of the environment that we live in. Currently, the squatters living in the national park are destroying the environment that we value. There's desertification that comes from cutting down trees that the squatters are using to feed their livestock, and it's not a sustainable way of life because the squatters continue to move further and further into the national park land, completely destroying this piece of forest that has many different species and resources that the Kenyans can use. So according to our responsibility to the environment, it would be best to remove the squatters completely from the national park area. We believe that putting up fences and putting guards is not only a violent measure, but also will not fully address the problem. That there are fences currently, and more money and more resources are continuously being put into guarding this national park area, but people continue to get into the national parks. I mean, as Americans, we understand this problem with the Mexican-American border, that we continue to put up fences. We still have an immigration problem. It is the same in this situation, that regardless of fences and guards, they will continue to live in there. As far as resources being used and the utility of the park, squatters being removed would be the best possible option because it would provide the greatest good for all of Kenyans. Currently, tourism contributes to 60% of the Kenyan economy, which is a fairly hefty portion, and a lot of that is based around this natural park that has these interesting and exotic species to the Kenyan park. And so putting up fences and putting guards would not only not remove the squatters that are chasing away tourism, but would also chase away the tourists themselves. Very few tourists want to go into a park that's guarded by military men all around the entire border. So we feel that this would detract from the overall beauty of the setting, as well as not removing the squatters. Excuse me. We also believe that the government should provide the squatting Kenyans with another place to live, with irrigation that would allow them to continue in the lifestyle that they have always continued, that by removing them from the land, the sort of climate issues and water issues that currently plague the park will go away, which will again increase tourism. Currently there are, I think it's flamingos that are living there and are being chased away because of the water resources used by the squatters. One objection might be that the resources to relocate the squatters, put them in housing, put them in irrigation, might be more expensive than simply putting up a fence and putting up guards. We would argue that yes, while this may be true that this is possibly more expensive, it will also be a more effective solution. That instead of continuously putting up fences and continuously finding measures to prevent people from getting in that won't actually work, that it would be more ethically sound to place them in other places. Also, because this respects the dignity of the squatters themselves, instead of just kicking them out and displacing them, which makes, you know, them obviously unhappy and in a destitute situation that the government then has to step in and take care of. A better option is to use the resources that would be used to place guards and put them in government housing so that they are also economically set and aren't trying to continuously get back into this park that is not environmentally sound. So in summation, we do not believe that the ethically permissible solution would be to put up fences, because we do not believe this will have the sort of impact and solution that is really needed for the Kenyans, that it will also be subjecting them to violence, that if they try and approach the fence, that the guards will somehow hurt them, and that a much less harmful way would be to use those resources that would go into fencing and instead put them in a situation, housing with irrigation, that would allow the Kenyans to be happy because their environmental resources are no longer being used, and also make the squatters happy because they're allowed to continue in the lifestyle that they previously led. Thank you.
Clemson, you now have a minute to confer and then 5 minutes to rebut.
We'd like to thank you, UNC Chapel Hill, for your presentation, and mostly we do agree with you definitely in answering the question that electric fences and guards to prevent illegal settlements are not morally or justified in this situation. However, we do disagree with you because you say that removing them is your solution and that you need to do that and put them in a better situation. We have a different solution that we'll get to later on in the case. But first of all, we want to address your actual solution, saying that we should move them out and put them in a place that would allow them to continue to lead a lifestyle that they did in the park. I think Cal is going to briefly address that.
As you mentioned, and as Anna mentioned, he said we should remove and relocate the squatters. But we don't know where exactly you would put them. This is a nationwide problem. The squatters are moving in there because they've been in other places and there's no arable land, there's no food, and so they're being forced into the forest for those reasons. And so we're not entirely sure how the government could put them somewhere else when the situation would not be much better anywhere else.
But we do agree with you that it is financially irresponsible and it's not right to use that force on them, and it's not going to be extremely practical to put up electric fences and armed guards everywhere. And then you talk about utilitarianism, and if we're going to do that, we can still agree that using these armed guards is going to be bad for the government, bad for the people, but so is moving them out. The people are moving in there because they don't have land in any other places. So if we were to move them out and attempt to relocate them, there's no other arable land. And also, I think some of the problems here, the squatters in the land are either pastoralist or nomadic. These are the two indigenous groups, the types of squatters that we have there. Pastoralist, herd, and that's where the tree cutting comes from, and they clear out lands for their herds. Nomadic, though, these are hunter-gatherers. They live in the land, they protect the trees, they gather fruits and berries from the land, and they use their resources and hunt when they can. They don't necessarily need acres and acres of land for grazing cattle. So how would you respond to that? We'll get to that actual question later. But it seems like you failed to recognize the adaptive nature and ability of some of these forest-dwelling communities. And since moving them out and relocating them isn't necessarily a practical alternative, we think that a better alternative would be working with them, which we would also like to use utilitarianism to support this. I'm saying that protecting these people and allowing them to live would cause great utility or lead to great utility, but protecting the forest is also going to need some utility as well. Moving them out doesn't really promote the greatest utility because it just creates overpopulation in other areas and puts them in a place where they can't sustain the land that they did, which you tried to use, saying we're going to uphold their dignity because they need that dignity. But if they can't actually do that, then why would we put them in a different area? So by the virtue of cooperation, we're going to say that the best solution would be for them to cooperate with the indigenous tribes, because there are groups such as the Maasai who use tourism and use it in that land. They're in national park land and they work with the government. The Maasai are a tribe that are known for protecting the land, protecting their species, their really traditional way of life, known for wearing their red robes, but they're not necessarily known for cutting down trees or destroying the land. They're living off of the land in a sustainable and conservative manner, and they draw in tourism. They have a conservation group, the Maasai Wildlife Conservation Group, and other tribes have other resources like this. The Forest Action Network is built of local communities, and it's an organization within Kenya that they use to promote the protection of the forest, but this can be squatters included. So our better solution is for the government to work with these communities and allot certain amounts of that land in the forest, or allow the squatters that are in the forest to use their adaptive measures to be recognized for what they can do and their adaptive nature and their ability to conserve the forest. And if they're allowed to live in those traditional ways within the forest while cooperating with the government and these organizations set up, then they would be able to uphold their dignity that they've had and live in that way that they are used to living. So a better solution, rather than just moving them out in an impractical manner into a place where there wouldn't necessarily be land for them to farm off of or live in or raise their cattle in, we think that the government should cooperate with them while they're living in these parklands. It would be more financially responsible, it would uphold their dignity, and it would produce greater utility by protecting the forest and the people. So our question to you is that, taking into account the adaptive and conservative nature of some of these forest-dwelling communities, would this affect your argument as to whether or not they should be moved out into a different location if they can still conserve the forest and promote utility there?
Okay, Team Chapel Hill, you have 5 minutes.
We'd like to thank University Clemson for their interesting response as well as their alternative solution. We'd like to critique your solution a little bit and defend our own with a few points.
The first point we'd like to make was that part of your solution hinged on the idea that there isn't any sort of arable land that exists outside of these parks, and that doesn't really appear to be true. More arable land can be created with the correct infrastructure. So if land that can be irrigated is irrigated, that's more arable land that that these settlers can be moved on to. And the government can also take it upon themselves to teach these settlers how to irrigate their land properly and to create more profitable services out of this land that you currently are looking at as not arable but can be made that way.
Certainly, as we discussed in our case, this would be creating this infrastructure would be an economically intensive process for the government. But we believe that it's absolutely essential to provide these individuals with another place to live that they won't be destroying. If necessary, the government asking for international aid from other nations, other groups, in order to provide for these new living spaces for these individuals. I think your charge that our alternative is impractical, we disagree with. I think it can be both practical and is the most ethically acceptable alternative.
You also, in providing your solution, defend yourself saying that there's this group of people who can live within the forest and be adaptive. We believe that you are ignoring the vast amount of squatters who do have cattle and cannot live within this forest area, that it is that it's a forest, that if you continue to cut down trees, that I would just be interested in seeing what specific environmental measures you would take in order to ensure that raising cattle could also be viable with having growing trees and not cutting them down.
Yeah, we think it's really untenable for the vast majority of individuals who are currently living in the park and not living with the park in a sustainable way, as the Maasai are. Really, under your solution, how do we deal with all of these individuals? Do we force them to change their traditional ways of life and start behaving how the Maasai behave? If they are unwilling to change their traditional way of life, how do we force them to do so? Certainly not by any type of violent means, as we've been discussing specifically in this case. I think in order for these individuals to stop harming the land, in order to protect all of the tourism revenue and other revenue that's coming from the natural resources inherent in this park, I think our solution of providing alternative space for these individuals to interact in and protecting their dignity so they can continue living in the traditional ways they always have is the best solution that we could find. Yep. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Judges, I will now ask you to confer, and then you'll have 10 minutes to ask questions.
According to the case, is that the government imposes costs on the squatters. That they're afflicted with barbed wire, electric wiring guards, and presumably that's very unpleasant. And your proposal is to put benefits on squatters, to give them a nicer place to live. Isn't that going to increase the number of squatters? And so make that the sensible potential squatter is going to look at the world and say, if I move next to the national parks, instead of being zapped by electrical fences or whatever, that I will be given some other place to live, and so that the problem will ratchet up. That you'll get your proposed solution will get more squatters to be dealt with some other way?
I think a crucial part of our argument for economic development in these regions leading to an alleviation of the squatter problem, you're absolutely correct. It can't just include moving these squatters to new areas and providing them with resources, because that definitely we have a population problem on our hands with more squatters, fewer, the same amount essentially of natural resources to support them. We're still going to have problems of individuals expanding, trying to find new places to live. I think a solution to this may be providing, once again, we have the issue of cost, but education, birth control initiatives. We look at population growth rates in industrialized nations like the United States or in Europe, and populations are actually shrinking in a lot of these regions. So I'm just trying to come up with a potential solution for the problem you've proposed. It's specifically a policy solution of how we can save this forest, but at the same time prevent excessive population growth that would create more squatters that might want to continue coming into this region.
Well, I wasn't even thinking of population growth. Simply that there's a certain number of people in the country, and so instead of being blacksmith in a village, you decide I'm going to become a squatter. So that there's, because of the change in how the government's behaving towards squatters, you decide that that's a better occupation than you are in now. And they're simply because as a squatter, you're getting, the government or the international community is giving you something. So it doesn't have anything to do with population. It's just you've changed from squatters getting net cost to squatters getting net benefits, and so it becomes simply a change in occupation, and you're going to ratchet up the problem that you've got to face.
I think our solution, instead of being a constant, any new people for now and in perpetuity who enter into the park, someone has decided to become a squatter, enters the park, immediately is taken out and given a house somewhere in Kenya. I don't think that's how we would necessarily implement this policy. I think it would be all of the individuals at a certain date when this policy was decided upon would be removed from the park, and the individuals who had been living there provided with these alternative accommodations. And perhaps there does need to be a way, ideally as nonviolent as possible, of preventing additional individuals from coming in just in order to, I guess, gain this squatter status. That might be a possible solution.
Okay, in an absolutely ideal world, I'm sure your solution would work, and indeed in an absolutely ideal world, I'm sure their solution would work. We don't live in an ideal world. We live with two things I'd like to draw your attention to and hear your views upon. One is the history of the Kenyan government and how likely it is to do this in a way that's beneficial. The other thing is the general history of relocation. Governments have been relocating populations, to my certain knowledge, at least since 1960, but probably for hundreds and hundreds of years. My impression is that the general history of this is actually very bad, and that governments are very bad at relocating, and people are very bad at being relocated. And I wonder if you want to address those empirical questions.
As far as the Kenyan government is concerned, we have reason to believe that in the Kenyan government that is currently in power, that there's less corruption than there has been in the past. And that these leaders there's two leaders in the Kenyan government, both the president and the prime minister. The UN actually stepped in to make that happen, and both of these leaders gave promises to the people on the land, the squatters, that they would be allowed to keep that land. This is a promise that I don't think they will keep or have kept, especially since we are, in fact, debating this case. As far as relocating goes, we do agree that there are issues with people being relocated and governments forcing the relocation, but that this solution gives us an opportunity to do something that history has not and make it possible?
Ultimately, we think, as you said, that any solution that we could come up with won't go off without a hitch, that there will be problems that we encounter, but we have to always look at the alternative. The alternative would be inaction. For all of the reasons that we've discussed, the presence of this national park in Kenya is absolutely crucial to the Kenyan people's well-being, for the taxes gained from tourism revenue, and also for climate change reasons. The presence of this park is slowing the process of desertification and allowing more land to be available for Kenyans. We've kind of entered this positive feedback cycle of losing more and more land, more and more people not having a place to live. And although no solution would be absolutely ideal, I think action is crucial at this point, and we simply need to implement the best solution that we can find, regardless of if it's absolutely ideal or perfect.
Your closing remark to the response on Clemson's commentary was, quote, when you relocate the squatters, they'll be living in traditional ways that they always have. To me, that's kind of a disconnect, because A, the squatters are an oppressed population. They've always been they've already been driven out of the way they have traditionally lived. So my ethically relevant concerns and considerations are we've already disrupted their societal and cultural norms. So how does moving the squatters get us anywhere? How are we going to get them back to living in the traditional ways they always have, just by relocating them again?
I guess we would argue first off that when we're speaking of allowing them to preserve their way of life, that is the nomadic or farm style life, and that we can move them to other arable land through irrigation and teaching them to irrigate. So in relocating them, we wouldn't be telling these cattle herders, okay, you must now become a blacksmith, that they would be able to preserve that lifestyle. We also believe that the lifestyle they are currently pursuing within the park is not sustainable, and that they are being driven out by their own means, that they will kill their own culture within a number of years because they're doing it in an unsustainable way. Soon there will be no land left for them to continue to lead this lifestyle. So our solution is to instead provide them with land that has the infrastructure that can sustain their culture.
It's also important to note that these people were initially driven out of their the lifestyles that they were living by climate change. And while there's not really much practically that we can do to alter this and return the climate to what it used to be, through means such as irrigation and that sort of thing, we can allow them to return to some semblance of their traditional ways that will still work within the practical world that we do live in right now.
Yeah, as you said, the right to social and cultural determination is a really important ethical issue that we're talking about in this case. And as she said, inaction is not the correct path to take in order to protect these tribes' ability to continue living in the traditional ways that they would like to live. As much park as possible needs to be protected, and to the fullest extent possible, considering limitations, the type of alternative lifestyle that we provide them with would be fitting as close to possible as the one that they would like to lead.
Now we'll ask the judges to tally their scores and press. To both teams. And a hand for our judges. The scores are Clemson University 143 and Chapel Hill 139.